Hello. Welcome to Andy Tales. After watching the video, make sure there's no one else in the room. Don't forget to write your city and the time in the comments.
Story 1. The Shadow in the Dorm. It was my first day in the new dormitory, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The building was old, but there was something charming about it, kind of like a character from an old movie. The hallways were long and narrow, and the rooms felt like they had stories to tell. I was a little nervous, because this was my first time living away from home, but I felt like everyone else was in the same boat. The first couple of days went by smoothly. I met a few students, got to know my roommates, and settled into my new routine. But one night, something changed. I had just finished studying in my room and was heading to the kitchen when I noticed a strange, dark shadow at the end of the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting or maybe even a trick of my eyes, but it seemed to move just slightly, like it was watching me. I brushed it off, assuming it was nothing, but the next night, the shadow was back, and this time, it was closer. It didn't make sense. The hall should have been empty at that hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding in the darkness, waiting. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling grew stronger every time I passed through the hall. I started noticing other strange things. Doors that were usually shut tight would be slightly ajar when I passed by. Even though I hadn't seen anyone in the hallway, the air in the dorm felt colder, and there were times when I could hear whispering in the dead of night. It was almost like the walls had a life of their own. A few weeks passed, and I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head. But then, one evening, after a long day of classes, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was coming back from the library when I saw the shadow again. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, motionless, eye-frowncy, not knowing whether to run or call for help. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if it was waiting for me to make a move. My heart was racing as I walked slowly toward it, telling myself it was just someone else from the dorm messing around. But when I got closer, I saw something I will never forget. The figure wasn't human. It had the shape of a person, but its features were obscured by a dark hood. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light from the hallway. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. My legs were frozen in place. I didn't know what to do. It felt like I was in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the wall. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I wasn't about to investigate further. For the next few days, I avoided the hallway as much as possible. I stayed in my room, keeping the lights on at all times, but that didn't stop the whispers. They kept coming, louder at night, sometimes during the day. I couldn't tell if they were real or just my imagination running wild. Eventually, I decided to do some research. I asked around, trying to find out if anyone else had seen anything strange in the dorm. To my surprise, a few of the older students knew exactly what I was talking about. One of them, a girl named Clara, told me that the dorm was built on the grounds of an old asylum that had been shut down decades ago. The rumors were that the spirits of the patients still lingered there, and some had even died under mysterious circumstances. It was then that I learned about the disappearance of a former student named Daniel. According to Clara, Daniel had lived in the very room I was staying in. He was a quiet guy, never really interacted with others much, and one night, he just vanished. No one knew what happened to him. His family was never notified, and he was never found. I couldn't believe it at first, but when Clara told me that Daniel's final words were reportedly "help me," it sent chills down my spine. I had been hearing those same whispers, those same words whenever I walked through the hallway. I don't know if the shadow I saw that night was Daniel, but I think it might have been. And I don't know if the spirits of the dorm are still haunting the place, or if I'm just imagining it all. All I know is that I haven't been able to sleep since that night, and every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, "Help me." Story 2. The Silent Roommate. It was my second year of university, and I had finally managed to get a dorm room all to myself. This was a big deal for me, as I had shared rooms with roommates in my first year, and some of them had been a little difficult to live with. I was excited to enjoy my newfound solitude, but I didn't realize just how weird things would get in this new room. At first, everything was normal. I unpacked, decorated my space, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful year. I was on the top floor of the dorm, which meant the only neighbors I had were across the hall. The hallway was quiet, and I barely saw anyone except for the occasional person walking by. But then, about a week into my stay, I noticed something strange. There was a guy who had moved into the room across from mine. I hadn't seen him around much, but I did occasionally hear noises coming from his room late at night, mostly sounds of furniture moving, like he was rearranging things. It was odd because, when I did see him in passing, he never seemed to acknowledge me, and I didn't hear him leaving his room in the morning, like a typical student would. One evening, after I finished my homework, I decided to go to the kitchen to grab a late-night snack. As I walked past his door, I heard the sound of someone moving around in there, but it was strange. It was as if the sounds were too deliberate, too careful, almost as though the person inside was trying to be quiet but didn't realize how obvious they were being. The noise stopped abruptly as I stood there for a moment, almost like they were waiting for me to go away, but I didn't hear a door opening or any footsteps. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just a late-night study session. The next morning, though, I ran into the guy in the hallway. He had this strange, vacant look on his face, like he hadn't slept in days. He was taller than me, but there was something unsettling about his posture. It was as if he was walking on autopilot, like a robot. We exchanged awkward glances, but he didn't speak to me, not even a hello. I tried not to think too much of it. I wasn't the type to get caught up in people's personal lives, but the odd behavior continued. Every time I passed his door, I'd hear noises. Sometimes it would be the sound of typing, like someone was on a computer, and other times it would be as if something heavy was dropped, but there was never any sign of him actually coming or going. One night, I decided to investigate. It was close to midnight, and I hadn't seen the guy all day. I knocked on his door, figuring I should at least introduce myself properly. Maybe he was just shy, but to my surprise, no one answered. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. My curiosity got the best of me, and I gently turned the door handle. To my shock, it was unlocked. I hesitated for a moment, but then, thinking it was a bit rude to leave without saying anything, I pushed the door open just a crack. At first, I thought I was looking at an empty room. The lights were off, and the only source of light was a small lamp by the bed. The room was impeccably neat, but there was something off about it. Everything in the room looked as though it had been arranged deliberately. The furniture was positioned in a way that didn't seem quite right, but the strangest thing was the bed was made perfectly, with no signs of anyone having slept there. I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the desk. It was a stack of papers with some sort of writing on them. I couldn't make out what it said, but it looked like random words, jumbled together. The paper was stained in places, and the words were written in thick, uneven handwriting. I was about to leave, when I heard the softest sound coming from behind, like a breath being drawn in slowly. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the bathroom. His face was pale, almost as if he hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. His eyes were wide, and he looked right through me, not acknowledging my presence at all. Without a word, he slowly turned and walked back into the bathroom. The door shut quietly behind him. I was frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't figure out what was happening, but I had a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. I quickly left the room, closing the door behind me softly. The next day, I told Myra about what had happened, but when she went to check on him, she came back looking confused. The guy had completely vanished. His belongings were still in the room. His clothes were neatly folded in the closet, but he was gone. No one had seen him leave, and there was no sign of him anywhere on campus. The strangest part, the next morning, a new name appeared on the room assignment list. Someone else was moving in, and they took the exact same room, but when I passed by the room, I saw a completely different guy walking out of it. Was it a prank, or something more sinister? I have no idea, but I never heard from that guy again, and I still can't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who lived in that room. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think I hear him moving around again, but when I look outside, no one's ever there. Story 3. A Hidden Tenant. It was the start of my sophomore year in college, and I had just moved into a new apartment. I had always lived in dorms before, but this year, I decided to rent a place off campus. The apartment was small, but it was affordable, and the location was perfect. It had everything I needed, and the best part was that it was just a 10-minute walk to campus. The landlord was an older woman named Mrs. Hawkins. She seemed nice enough, but there was something off about her. She was very quiet and had an almost eerie way of speaking, as though she was always holding something back. But I didn't let her bother me. I signed the lease, paid my deposit, and moved in. At first, everything was great. The apartment was cozy, and I enjoyed the quiet. I lived alone, which was a huge relief after a year of dorm life. But after a few weeks, I began to notice strange things. Little things at first. The lights would flicker sometimes, and I'd hear faint sounds in the walls, like someone was walking around inside them. But I figured it was just old plumbing or the building settling. It was an old apartment complex, after all. Then things started getting weirder. I'd leave for class in the morning and come back in the afternoon to find that the apartment door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before I left. I began double-checking the lock each time I left, but it kept happening. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps coming from the hallway outside. Even when I was alone, it didn't make sense. The building wasn't exactly full of tenants, and most of the apartments were vacant. One evening, after a long day of classes, I came back to the apartment feeling exhausted. I had left for class early in the morning, and it was nearly 10 p.m. When I returned, I walked inside and immediately felt the cold air that seemed to linger in the apartment. It was strange, considering the heating was on, but it felt like the temperature dropped significantly as soon as I stepped inside. I did a quick check of my apartment. Everything seemed fine. I locked the door and then proceeded to my bedroom. But when I opened the door, I stopped dead in my tracks. The room was different. The bed was slightly askew, like someone had been sitting there. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the smell. It was faint, but I could clearly smell someone's cologne. A very strong cologne, one I didn't recognize. I figured it must have been a prank by a friend. Maybe someone had come into my apartment without my knowing, but I was sure I had locked the door before I left. Still, I tried to brush it off and went to bed. The next morning, I was running late for class, but when I went to take a quick shower, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the bathroom mirror, was a handprint, a smudge handprint that looked fresh. It was clearly visible on the condensation of the mirror, but I knew I hadn't touched it. Now, I was starting to panic. I texted my friend, but they just laughed it off. They told me I was probably just tired and imagining things, but I knew something was off. The whole building had a strange vibe to it, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds in the apartment rustling, like someone was moving around. I checked all the rooms, even under the bed, but no one was there. I was about to call it a night when I heard a faint noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was rummaging through the drawers. I grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously crept down the hallway. As I reached the kitchen, I frowned in my tracks. There, sitting at the kitchen table, was a figure, a man, dressed in a worn-out jacket, his face obscured by a hood. He was completely still, like he wasn't breathing. He just stared ahead, not moving, not acknowledging me. I couldn't move. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, slowly, the figure turned his head toward me. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't say anything. He just stared. I felt my entire body go numb, and before I could react, he stood up, walked toward the door, and disappeared into the hallway. I rushed to the door, locked it, and called the police. But when they arrived, the apartment was completely empty. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of a break-in, nothing. The officers looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen. I was too shaken up to stay there, so I stayed with a friend for the night. The next day, I decided to leave the apartment for good. I went to Mrs. Hawkins to tell her I was moving out. When I mentioned the strange things that had been happening, her expression immediately changed. She looked at me with a strange, almost sorrowful look. "You shouldn't have moved into that apartment," she said quietly. "I warned the others, but no one listens." She didn't elaborate, but as I was leaving, she whispered one final thing. "You weren't the first one to see him." I never went back. The apartment is still vacant, and I often wonder what was living there. Some things are better left unexplained.